Good morning, everyone. This is one of our Breakfast with Relogs. I can't remember how many. I think it's number 8 session.
Correct.
Hope you're going to learn from it, and you're always welcome, whoever's on board, whether you're customers, competitors, clients, suppliers. It's just a service to the industry to try have a conversation with the industry on what's current and what are the issues that affect us as we go forward in the area that we perform, which is in supply chain. Based on what happened in South Africa and the world since the beginning of 2020 with COVID-19, then we had the KZN Riots and some riots in Joburg. We've got some major supply chain pressures and delays happening around the world. So all of that affect our supply chain. And the objective was to have a discussion on how we can build a resilient supply chain and distribution infrastructure to be able to service customers going forward, understanding the weaknesses and the challenges that we're faced with. So today I've got a really esteemed panel. I'm going to start on the left in the way the names were put up on no order of preference. So Peter Njono is the CEO and founder of Twiga Foods. So Peter is sort of representing an international view on things. Peter's based in Kenya, Nairobi, and Twiga Foods is a food distributor to the informal sector and to business sector. It's a B2B business, which we work with in Kenya in developing their new supply chain. Below Peter, we have Solly Engelbrecht, who's the Group Logistics Executive for SPAR. So Solly will largely be looking at the experience of a retailer and a grocery FMCG retailer and what their issues are and give us a perspective on that. Andrea Agostini is the head of engineering at Foschini Retail Group. So Andrea similarly will give us a perspective on how things affect the apparel business and the furniture business and the non-food business, and what are the challenges there, because they are very different to what you have in FMCG. We then have Benny Stapelberg, who's the Chief Supply Chain Finance and Strategy Manager from Pick n Pay. And I think Benny's going to give us more of a financial aspect of the effects of these things. Being the finance guy, give us a little bit of a taint on how these things affect the money and what his perception of that. So I think it gives a nice round view. Rob Thompson is a divisional director. Good morning, Rob, at Zenprop, one of the property developers. They have industrial property, they have warehouses, they have shopping centers. So I think Rob is well qualified to talk about it from a perspective of the landlord and what's happening on that side. And then lastly but not least, Andy Duplicy is the managing director at Food Forward. And Food Forward is, as we all know, a wonderful organization that tries to prevent food going to waste and any surplus food going into the market to help with the poor people and people that are struggling. And with the results of all the problems we've had in the last 2 years, I think Andy is busier than ever. So thanks, Andy, for being on the panel. So, did this jump 2 slides? Okay, so the first question I had was, what is a resilient supply chain? And I suppose at the end of the day, what is expected from a supply chain? And it's really the ability to deliver on time in full. You can put some sense of what are the costs and what are the risks if I have a percentage delivery and so on. But if you really talk about it at its base level, you want to deliver on time in full. That's what the customer is expecting, and whether it's up or down the supply chain. So if you're a grower, you want to deliver it into your customer, the DC, what they want on time in full. If you're a DC delivering to a store, you want to deliver to the store on time in full. And I don't think it makes any difference whether you're clothing or whether you are FMCG or fruit and veg, it has the same effect. And at the end of the day, if you're a store and you're doing servicing your customer or e-commerce, you want to deliver to the customer directly, and indirectly you want to deliver to there. So, and there are costs to it and there are risks to it, and I suppose there are percentages of fulfillment that one accepts as part of business. But obviously getting down to a zero ability is a failure, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So what are the components? We look at the planning, the sourcing, transport, the warehousing, distribution, the labor, the packaging, the logistics. All of that makes up the components of the supply chain. And there's way more. And I don't want to type this conversation discussing and educating people on supply chain. I'm hoping everyone knows enough. And if you don't, we're a good consultant. Contact us and we'll train and teach you for a fee. Okay, so I've done my marketing bit. Okay, so one of the good things that came out of all the riots and so on, they all say there's a silver lining on the cloud. And the first thing is supply chain is recognized for its importance in our lives. You cannot watch CNN, BBC Prime, any news bulletin without the word supply chain coming up at the moment. And up to now, it was taken for granted. If people had heard of it, they didn't know the context. Most people in South Africa heard supply chain and they thought about procurement and all the corruption around tenderpreneurs. That was supply chain. It had a tainted perception. Today, supply chain finally has the recognition needed. And my late mother probably can now be a bit proud. You know, in the old days, she would have wanted me to be a doctor, a lawyer. Now she can say, well, my son, the supply chain professional, whatever it is. Okay, but moving on from that, our decisions on sourcing and pricing and products, where we get them from and the type of products, often were made without any consideration of supply chain and the risks of supply chain and the time of supply chain and the cost of supply chain. It was purely on where we could get the cheapest product and the biggest range and whatever. But with the disruptions that occurred with COVID, the restrictions in different countries, the ongoing effects, the chip shortages, the container shortages, fuel price variations, labor in certain markets, it's certainly going to affect the ability to supply. And I think that's going to affect what we have going forward. So the first, what are the lessons we have learned from the COVID-19, the KZN Riots, the international? Okay. So the first point, let's just go back again. Sorry, I jumped a slide. With a pandemic, we've been surprised by the changes on our supply chain. We weren't expecting the riots. No one, if I had spoken to people in June this year and said we could expect and we should be planning for this type of event, people would have thought I go around smoking some seriously illegal stuff. Okay, but today, if I say, can this happen again? Everyone says, we don't think we've solved the problem. We don't think it's a non-event going forward, okay? So with all these lessons and the shortcomings of what we see in our infrastructure, what can we do going forward? So the first set of questions that I had to discuss is what insights can you share? What lessons have we learned? What are our risks and what do you think we can do better? And I'm happy that anyone can jump in. I'm sure Solly is sitting below me on the screen. Solly, jump in.
Gary, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody, and thank you very much to everybody dialed in. And Gary, thank you very much for the invite. I think, you know, if we just look at these insights, you've bundled a lot of them together. But I think if we just start with COVID-19, one of the key insights is that our ability to deal with something that nobody has ever dealt with before, and the speed of learning that had to take place. And one of the real things that stood out for me is the way that the industry, especially on the retail food side, actually worked together on this non-competitive issues. I mean, Benny was part of a team where we looked at what can we learn from each other, because as we all know, COVID was new. Nobody knew what was happening. So it was the key insight that there's actually opportunities to actually share information and work together without compromising the competitiveness. That was a key insight. Lessons learned is be flexible. You know, at the end of the day, there was no contingency plan that could prepare you for either COVID or the KZN riots. No contingency plans could foresee what happened. Yes, with hindsight, we can say, listen, we could have seen this or we could have seen that. But the reality is there was no foresight at that stage in terms of what's happening. I think our key risk is firstly protecting our people and making sure that our people are safe to come to work and safe to operate in an environment, not only our people in the DC, but also our drivers, which is key at the end of the day, given what happened at Mooi River and what happened on the N3. So the first risk is to our people, and the second risk is to our infrastructure, both at store level and at DC level. What I think we can do better, I do believe this has taught us, both COVID and the KZN riots, that there's opportunities for the industry to work closer together on non-competitive issues and share learnings and share intelligence. That's just in a nutshell from my side, Gary.
Thank you, Solly. That was a great insight. Benny, Andrea, Peter, anyone? Benny, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I think obviously a lot of, thanks Gary, thanks for the invite. Yeah, so I think a lot of what Solly said is obviously resonates with us as well. We're in the same industry. I think one of the key insights for me on this, dealing with COVID-19, and we had some crises where we had staff walking out of our DCs that didn't want to work, and then in KZN we had 2 DCs that was completely destroyed. So you obviously it's great to have BCP plans and have them documented and have them rehearsed and everything, but when the crisis hits you, you need people on the ground that can act on those plans, and not every plan is perfect, so they need to be able to make decisions on the ground. So I think having a strong operational team on the ground is I think is one of the key things to deal with these sort of unforeseen events. People that are willing to sit down for 16 hours a day and sort out the issues, have the ear on the ground. So I think we need to focus on and have good, strong operational teams in place. That was a key one for us. Yeah, I think on what we can do better is sharing intelligence. We working with the security companies now to get better intelligence on what's happening. Because we didn't see the riots coming at all. Yeah, thanks, Gary.
Okay, Peter.
Morning, Gary.
Oh, Andrea, jump in.
Yes.
Jump in.
Again, thanks for inviting me, and good morning to everybody listening. I think, without answering all the questions again, I think there's a lot of repeat learnings and insights that we've all had out of these situations and crises, as well as the COVID. But also key insights for us is, if you look at the riots, we certainly see that the supply chain is certainly a targeted area. So a key insight is that we need to have an agile supply chain that can respond to big crises like this, because I don't think with all the best intelligence you're going to be able to easily predict where a riot will happen. This one happened in KZN, locked us in, kind of shut all imports via the main arteries. So, next time it will be something else. So to try and predict them all and to try and prepare for them all is going to be quite difficult. And I think the key insight for us, as Benny and Solly also mentioned, is to have good intel. And again, I suppose we were lucky. We have set this up because being in a retail and store environment and being exposed to a lot of, call it shoplifting, hijacking, and armed robberies, etc. We have formed a solid operational on the ground fraud risk and reaction team, and we were quite lucky to be able to respond with protecting product and staff, and but again, we weren't able to protect property. We weren't able to protect some of the goods, So again, to try and, what we learned was that we need to be able to react and be able to pivot, probably shipping of containers to different ports, learn to react on the fly. And what we did find is that obviously legislation doesn't allow you to do that. You can't just divert a container to another port easily. Things don't happen easily. So we're going to start challenging those opportunities, because if this does happen again, we need to be able to use all our infrastructure effectively. We were just stuck. The ships just docked outside the port.
I think the one thing that the world must accept is we were actually, even though this is a horrible event, we were very lucky in what happened. and that it only happened in KZN. Had it, God forbid, happened in the Joburg DC, where you've got a much higher concentration, imagine the effect on people's lives and businesses.
Well, imagine they hit both Cape Town and Durban Port. Those are main arteries into the country. I mean, what then? We were hamstrung, but we coped. We managed to cope, and obviously with our infrastructure being, and I think a lot of the panel have infrastructure around the country. You are able to pivot around those infrastructure locations to be able to survive. You lock down the area that's affected, but the rest can survive. You know, but if an industry is very reliant and only reliant on imports, you could have been really hammered. And you know, so Cape Town was left untouched to a degree, and I think that helped. But you know, when you want to bring the country to a standstill, you have clever people out there that orchestrate these things and will orchestrate it differently. And you know, it's an interesting next 2 years, 3 years that we will need to rethink our BCPs, our strategies. And I think you'll touch on that later.
Yeah, let's get a perspective from Peter from Kenya. Obviously, Peter experienced the disruptions due to COVID and luckily didn't affect the disruptions due to our riots. I don't know if they've had any local types of disruptions there of a similar event, but at the same time, he can have a perspective on what he saw from an outside in, and also what effect they had in their supply chain due to COVID, which may have been different to what we had in South Africa.
Thanks a lot, Gary. So just in terms of introduction, Twiga is a B2B e-commerce business, and we're based out here in Kenya, and we're in a couple of cities. And one of the things that happened during the COVID season is that we had restricted access to pretty much other parts of the country, at least for a short period of time. And that was in the early part of COVID. Because for us, the COVID journey as a country started on the 12th of March, 2020. And because of our restricted access, one of the things that we did very, very early on is that we set up agile teams. And those agile teams were to focus primarily on how do we then keep the trains running on time. And it means that, you know, we had to deal with different types of issues, you know, from scheduling of trucks, from managing of shifts in the warehouses and all. And I think also what compounded our problem is that we've continued to grow pretty at a pretty decent clip. Between March of last year and last month, you know, we've more than quadrupled our business during that period. So the thing is that, so you have the challenge of the supply chain disruption that is happening, and at the same time, you're actually really stretching your capacity. And one of the things that we've been working on with Gary and his team is how we then transition to a new distribution center that we've been working on for the last couple of months. And one of the challenges that we faced is that the project fell significantly behind schedule because of challenges around shipping. There was huge delays at the port, you know, huge delays in terms of clearing vital components that were required for our distribution center. And when you put all that together, it really strained our business materially. So we're now moving into our distribution center. But the thing is that even moving into that distribution center, you know, we've outgrown some of the plans that we had initially put together. So one of the things now is that we're having to now sit back and figure out ways in which we can further optimize some of the things in that distribution center to ensure that it's able to meet our requirements. And I think one thing that has taught me during this period is one is the importance of having a well thought through supply chain plan, but also figuring out ways in which you can actually build a bit of flexibility in terms of your expansion, especially from an assortment standpoint, or maybe from the different products that would actually be growing at a significant clip. So our problem is slightly different, where we faced significant disruptions from shipment of material into the country, into the project. We had restricted access across the country, which we managed to resolve. And at the same time, we really stretched our capacity theme. So, sometimes, it kind of feels like you're burning on both ends just to keep the trains running on time. But one of the things we really appreciate is the expertise that Relog brought on board just to help us manage some of this complexity.
And it's been challenging for us even as consultants. We couldn't get to site when you wanted to be on site with travel restrictions. But we've all worked through it and made the learnings. I suppose let's ask Rob for his perspective from a developer and property landlord, and then we'll jump into Andy last.
Yeah, Gary, thanks, man. Thanks for having me, man. Look, I think both COVID and the unrest it's clear it's been devastating for everyone. I think for us, the nuances were slightly different in that COVID, we kind of were all in it together. And that I mean globally. It wasn't just KZN, it wasn't just South Africa. We were all in it together globally. And I think various strategies and business models were severely tested. And I think what came out of it is that there's no one size fits all. And the key to it, as I think Andrea or Benny said, was going forward is adaptability. And we're going to have to be able to react very quickly going forward to these kinds of events. COVID in particular, I think that kind of event could well happen again in a different guise. And for us, COVID was all about damage control. The positive was, all being in it together. We had to really get to know our tenants a lot more intimately. Their survival meant our survival. So it was about damage control. What kind of relief could one collectively provide? It was approaching the banks to get their kind of input to, so that everyone got through this. The riots, are completely as devastating, possibly even more devastating, but a completely different feel for us in any event. I don't know how many of you live in KZN. I'm based in KZN, and what went down was nothing short of alarming. The scale of it, the speed at which it all unfolded, I don't think anyone could have contemplated or even planned for. We lost two big DCs, the big Massmart DC in Rivers Valley, and then the Cornubia TV plant for LG Electronics. And those are two massive facilities which have been torched and destroyed. And unless you were in KZN and you drove past this and experienced it, it was literally like being on the set of a Mad Max movie. That's how eerie it was. And it was evil. It just had a different feel and flavor to it. My worry about that is the long-term damage and trust deficit to KZN, Durban as a city, and South Africa as a country. It's critical we get that trust back. And I don't know if that's going to be very easy.
Thanks, Rob. Let's have from Andy. I think Andy saw it from a people perspective.
Thank you very much, Gary. So what was quite interesting, let's start with the KZN riots, is that the moment everything shut down and the threats were coming, we got calls from our supply chain partners, our retail partners, our manufacturing partners, and said, can you help us out? Because even as you all know, during the best of times, there are supply chain disruptions throughout the equation. But when things like riots happen, things like the pandemic happen, then of course those kind of issues are exacerbated. And so I think it was a good testing period between ourselves and our food owners, which are our farmers, wholesalers, retailers, manufacturers, that all came and said, we need support. We've got food. We can't get it out the way it needs to be. Are you able to intercept that food? And that's how our organization, is premised on intercepting good amounts of food before it is lost or wasted throughout the supply chain. And I think our partners saw the real value of long-standing partnerships with, we've got partnerships with Pick and Pay, with Massmart, Food Lovers Market, and companies like Tiger Brands, RCL and others. And we were able to work together to make sure that the losses, the food losses weren't as great as they would have been without our support. So it was great to see that. And as a result of that, some of our partners are now working with us on digital solutions at store level. We're working with Woolworths and with Pick n Pay to roll out our digital technology food share to make sure that at store level, at regular times, we are able to intercept food. So those were some of the benefits there. One of the key learnings I think we must all keep in mind is the KZN riots started with very specific reasons, and it was orchestrated, it was manipulated. But one thing we must keep in mind is, although that was orchestrated and manipulated, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were readily available to do what they did. They're sitting at home, they're doing nothing, they are unemployed, they are at risk of suffering from food insecurity, social issues. And I think this is the heart of the problem. Supply chain needs to be resilient, and it is. You can see supply chains have built in resilience throughout the years. But what we're seeing is there are people sitting at home, and all it takes is one nudge, and that wave could come. And I think what needs to happen is big business that you've invited here, companies like Pick n Pay and SPAR and Food Lovers Market and all the partners, you guys need to keep business accountable, because government accountable, because government needs to do better on that side. If government addresses social issues better, we'll have less people available to do the kind of things that they have done. And I think it's important that big business continues to put pressure on government to create that framework where economic growth, the environment around economic growth is there, and that government reacts faster, like the KZN looting. It was unacceptable how long it took for them to react. Government should have reacted faster. Our security cluster should have done better. And big business must keep government accountable in that regard.
Thank you. And I think let's move on to some of the other points. So obviously we had the pandemic, sudden and unplanned effects, lockdown, restriction on product categories, supply chain effects, there's port delays going on, food security, supply and managing our waste is an issue. The second point, what effect did we see from COVID? And we may have touched it already. What were our weaknesses? Should we be looking at onshoring as an option and reduce our exposure to imported product? Do we need to think differently about sourcing, planning, and logistics? Do we need to have more backup stock? I see that some of our customers see that there's a delay in shipping and so on, and are overbuying. And so suddenly our DCs are coming under pressure because our inventory days are not what are planned. We're buying insurance inventory just in case, because we don't know what the effect is. And this could have a play out effect, because we pick up some of the overstock, and then other countries have, or other customers have shortages because people are being greedy to take up their allocation. So what do we need to do to change? Let's start from the bottom, Andy.
So I like what one of your panelists said earlier. I forget which one it was, my apologies. But although Pick n Pay and SPAR and ShopRite are competitors, they found common ground in dealing with certain issues that affected them all. And I think that's important. I think working together, we can solve the problems faster and we can be more reactive. So from our perspective, we think stakeholder engagement broadly is important. Consultation broadly is important. I like what I think it was Benny that said earlier, that they are now have a closer relationship with security people so that they understand better what's happening on the ground. And that kind of information can be shared with the competitors so that everybody is aware, because we know for a fact nobody is isolated when it comes to these kind of disruptions, this kind of looting and stuff that takes place. If it affects one DC, it's going to affect the competitor's DC. So I think, stakeholder relations, in spite of your competitiveness, find common ground and see what we can do to work better, to collaborate broadly, and to understand what's happening in communities so that we can react faster to the kind of issues that arise.
Thanks, Andy. Anyone else put a hand up? Come on, let's go. Benny?
Okay, yeah, I think I would like to talk about the onshoring a little bit, about imports. I mean, we definitely seen in our clothing business that has an impact that we couldn't get stock on time, and we had to cancel some orders. And we are definitely looking for some local sourcing options and increasing our local procurement on that. My question just as on local sourcing is two things. And one is we need to make sure it's sustainable, because as soon as the supply chains internationally open up and we start competing against China again, you know, the local industry needs to be able to compete. So again, we're going to have to put pressure on government to make sure that we use this opportunity to get the local industry going. And then, of course, sometimes you think you're sourcing local, but your supplier is actually very dependent on overseas supplies in any case. So I think we're going to need to gather better intelligence around where does it actually come from. You know, how dependent are the suppliers that supply to you on overseas supply. So that's definitely something we need to look at.
I think Andrea has probably similar comments on that, especially being in the apparel business. And before you jump in, Andrea, just so everyone knows, you know, on FMCG and food, it's everyone's available. It's an annual product. With apparel and fashion, it's about a 1-year lead time for anything coming. You've got to get the cloth, you've got to get the patterns, you've got to get manufactured. So I mean, a lot of the effects of what we've seen now, we'll only see the results in a year to 18 months time. So I'm sure that's why Andrea's lost all his hair.
Yeah, yeah, quite true. You know, in the retail business, I guess I'm generalizing, I guess, with imports, with sourcing internationally, with sourcing locally, lead times aren't always the best as a start. And then you throw something like COVID, or you throw something like a riot or a port closure, and all of a sudden, you're right, you have an impact of months to years that affects your business. But certainly what we saw out of COVID, and I think everybody is now quite aware of this now, is how online just took off. And in 2020, 2019, 20, everybody was really getting into the online space and was planning their 5-year strategy, and COVID hit. And COVID actually accelerated and brought that 5 years down to zero. Literally, you had to cope with a 5-year growth spurt that you were only planning for over 5 years. And so that really hit us quite hard. And, you know, and when you talk about a weakness, it's just about how do you pivot your business to be able to adapt quickly to react to that. And I think we learned a lot of lessons out of that process. The whole onshoring thing, a very interesting debate. I think TFG, you may see in the media already, is we saw this coming many years ago, that we had to reinvest in South Africa, had to reinvest in the textile industry. And so luckily for us, we have gone a long way in onshoring quite a bit of our business and growing the textile industry again. So the one thing government has been good at is working with us to revitalize that sector, and we're doing a lot of work with them. But certainly onshoring and a balance of import and onshoring, I guess we need to look at as industry. We can't always put your eggs in one basket, and definitely we need to rethink how we source and plan, especially on the planning side. As you say, you kind of buy for insurance, but again, it's understanding, you know, someone made a comment earlier, maybe even offline, is DCs were built by salespeople, but, you know, planning may also be done by non-supply chain people. And all of a sudden things do go pear-shaped when it hits the fan. And so these are the things that we really need to change going forward, is really have a supply chain base and understanding in all our works. And it's not just that sector of actually moving the stock, it's everything that links to it. And that certainly is quite a key element I think we need to be focusing over the next short while, just to make ourselves a lot more agile and a lot more precise.
I think one of the things that I've seen is we actually had a very good textile apparel industry in this country from the days
Very good. Yeah.
from the days of sanctions, where we were forced to develop it. And
Correct.
unfortunately, with the price parity that came with China, everyone jumped onto price, but never looked at the full equation in terms of shipping and costs and lead time. I mean, because lead time planning is much longer from China, and the inventories went up, but because the costs were so low, they built it in. I don't think with the new shipping costs that we're seeing right now, those decisions would never have been made if the delays and the shipping costs were on the table the way it is now. I don't think people would have offshored at that stage.
Exactly right. And yeah, I guess China is an economy that needs to fuel itself. You need to feed that monster, and they will always be competitive. So I think a good balance of onshore versus imports is always going to be on the table. It's just how you mitigate any risks. And again, as you said, supply chain has become so topical now that big countries make big decisions by affecting its supply chain. Literally, you talk fuel, you talk food, you talk anything, and the biggest lever is your supply chain. If you just disrupt it a little bit, you can start making people make decisions. And unfortunately, it's then the supply chain that then needs to recover that economy. And it's quite interesting how the one is used as a lever to affect change or to make decisions, but then it collapses the economy, and then it's the same supply chain that has to fix it. So, and to get it back on its feet. So it's really a weird scenario that plays itself out. But yeah. Supply chain is a key area.
Does anyone else want to add to this, or should we move on to the next?
Gary, if I could just from our perspective, being a property landlord, two things have been quite interesting coming out of COVID. Once the possible change from just in time to just in case, which you alluded to earlier, whether that's a knee-jerk reaction or whether it's a long-term model going forward. Once the initial lockdown levels started to ease, we very definitely saw take up of space, industrial space, and I think whether that's a knee-jerk reaction to carrying bigger inventory, just so that one has stock and has comfort. It'll be interesting to see if that's going to be a long-term strategy. And then touching on what Andrea said is just the remarkable change in consumer behavior to online. It really just brought forward this whole e-commerce for South Africa, quite dramatically. And, it actually became quite fun to be sitting at home working with all the kids at home and everything. And, a delivery would arrive and you'd all kind of try and guess which one it was and who it was for. And, I think it's
like Christmas every day.
Yeah, it certainly, I think the consumer now has a lot more trust in that whole online experience, and that's a good thing. So, from our side, the positives that have come out of COVID is take up of space, and this e-commerce. The negative to, I guess, all of that is certainly the take up of more space and carrying more inventory does, I guess, add to the cost of doing business, and I guess ultimately the consumer will feel that.
And Rob, obviously the residential or the office space landlord is maybe sitting on the opposite end of that scale, where obviously your warehouse tenants are growing, or space is growing and capacity requirements are growing. The other landlords on the office side, with the work from home kind of debate now happening, they're probably on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, look, I mean, the office market was already feeling the heat, I think, even before COVID. It's certainly the sector that's been hardest hit, and probably the most unpopular at the moment and worst performing.
And technologies like what we're using now has been part of the death knell of that.
No, it has, but I think it's not. This technology is not for everyone, Gary. It's kind of, we're a little bit older, and I think we've kind of you know, happy to maybe sit at our nice homes and Zoom in. And if you're a youngster, you know, ambitious, trying to get going, you want to, you know, you want your boss to see you working hard, putting in the extra hours, you know, you want someone to mentor you, you want that collaboration. You maybe live you share a flat with someone, you know, that's maybe not so nice to be working from home. And, you know, so there's all those other soft issues. I'm not so sure. I mean, I say that, geez, every day you read about Deloitte saying, you know, staff can work from home or remotely, PwC, but I'm not so sure that's going to be a long-term problem for the office market. I'm more worried about retrenchments and downsizing.
There's going to be a change in who works from home, who works from companies. I mean, as you say, people don't have work from home infrastructure. Houses aren't built with an office. So to add it and to make it comfortable, you can't sit at your kitchen table while they're cooking food trying to do your day's job. If you don't have that, and you can't be productive.
And I mean, you
so
know,
we run a hybrid in our company where the guys that want to work from home and can work from home choose to, where we have all our youngsters and new employees at the office for training and mentoring and development. We have all our staff in the office whenever we're doing designs and workshops, because you cannot do those things practically remotely. And we also face-to-face with our clients in those situations, as much as sometimes they don't want to, but we have to. And we've had to learn to be successful working through that process. I see Solly's got his hand up.
Thanks, Gary. Maybe if you just go to the previous slide, Gary, I think there's just one or two comments I want to make on that, please. I think all the speakers spoke about very, very relevant issues, and I can just see from what came out of it for us, and specifically related to COVID. When this whole thing started, we were very fortunate to be able to reach out to our colleagues in SPAR China and SPAR Europe. And when we did our scenario planning, it became quite clear there's only one thing we can do, is that to create a safe environment. Now, by safety, I mean that our staff had to see that our places of work must be safe. It must almost be safer for them at work than at home or while they're in transit. And I think all of us then focused on that. But also more importantly is the quality of communication has definitely improved, that you can be seen as a reliable source of information to protect our staff and what was going on as well. So I think that was a key issue, because reliability, trust of communication, the effectiveness of communication, one message that went out became so critical during this COVID. And what we're now seeing is that by building that trust, it just makes life easier to make sure that people can trust you going forward with what you've got to say about anything that's developing. And we've also seen during the riots, where people are more trusting in terms of what we want to achieve and what we were saying about various things that was taking place in the workplace. So I think that's perhaps the biggest impact, that it assisted, although it was a very difficult period, it actually assisted everybody to build the trust by ensuring quality and reliable information sharing, and also making sure that people, that the workplace is seen as a safe environment. That's the bottom line. You know, we went to such an extent that we actually transported our staff to work and back, just to make sure that we can reduce the impact of COVID. So I think that is the key. The key is, how did we use this to build trust with all our stakeholders, not just our employees, but also with our retailers, and just as important with our suppliers as well, because the same challenges we had, our suppliers also had, and our retailers also had. So how did we build that supply chain of trust, reliable information, and making sure that things can still take place at the right time? Thank you.
Thanks, Solly. Let's move on to the next point. I think, so we had COVID, then we July riots and looting, and we lost facilities, stores, lost sales, lost production, lost confidence. And what were the effects of this? And how do we handle this? What about the rebuilding, the ability to serve, the ability and the lessons learned in that to be able to be there? So what do we see? If you can just give me a problem, my phone has decided to play music. Don't ask me why. Okay. And what do we see from the unrest? Do you think we can limit the effects of such events on our supply chain? what have we identified as our weaknesses? Can we make security to our sites impenetrable? Is it possible? Do we need to think differently about the location, the labor, the automation we have, centralization? Should we have more distributed facilities and less risk centrally? What do we need to change? What are your thoughts on these things? How to build a disaster recovery plan in terms of infrastructure? I think every company's got wonderful disaster recovery from an IT perspective. And they have these big disaster recovery sites. But have we actually thought about physical disaster recovery infrastructure? And if these riots had to take place again, what would our reactions be? So I think let's jump in. And I think I want to actually start with Peter, who's foreign to the riots, and get a perspective from an international view, how he would see some of these points differently if it had to occur in Kenya into his business. Has he thought differently about these problems now that he's seen that it did actually happen in South Africa? And could it happen in Kenya? Who knows? One can never say never. Peter, would you be happy to jump in on such a good question?
So thanks a lot. I mean, riots are not new to us. Next year we're having our elections. So this is actually something that we're thinking about in terms of our contingency planning. But one of the things that we have been working through, and I think it was mentioned by some of the panelists, is one is around also simplifying our supply chain and just reducing the points of failure. So I'll give you an example. When we started out Trigger, we were sourcing, for example, our fresh produce from 15,000 farmers. That means that your trucks are going all over the country in different regions and bringing those products to a central location. So what we're doing now is we're rationalizing some of that to ensure that we have fewer supply points, that at least reducing that point of failure. The second thing that we're doing is we've introduced a WMS. I mean, for many of you, that might look like something that's pretty hygiene. So for us, with operations, we've been operating without a warehouse management system, and everything has been more or less around a manual process. By transitioning to that, it allows us now to have a single view of truth of where everything is coming and where everything is going. And that level of information is something that we did not have before, and it helps us to better prepare in terms of disruption, because now we have better visibility of everything that's happening from a supply chain standpoint, and allowing us to then interface this into the fulfillment process in terms of what it is that we need to be delivering to different customers. And this allows us then to have information that allows us to then have contingency planning. If you're to have a supply chain disruption at any of those nodes, at least then you can then figure out ways in which you can then make up for that disruption with the amount of data that you have, which allows you to respond faster. And I think for many of the panelists that we have today, I think one of the things that allowed a quicker recovery is also just the amount of information that you have and how that then impacts planning, and it impacts visibility of what needs to get done in the face of a disruption. The third piece, of course, is how we think about our personnel and how we also structure the various teams that we have. And one of the things that we're starting to build is more around contingency planning and just thinking about different skill sets that we have and thinking about how you build redundancies underneath those skill sets. One thing you'll find is that in some areas, you may have vulnerability of how your staff is structured, in that you have subject matter experts who do not have maybe understudies in particular areas. And one of the things that we realize is that when these particular individuals cannot work 24 hours. So one of the things that we're doing now is also trying to do it from a HR standpoint, to then think about it from, if we have this skill set, what redundancies do we then need to build? And how do those redundancies play out when you start doing the scenario planning on various scenarios that may play out? And some of the scenarios we work through is like, for example, you may have certain places cut off. When they're cut off from your supply chain, that means that either are you losing your customers or are you losing supply into the main distribution center? And those are the kind of scenarios that we're playing around with right now, and looking at it from the perspectives that are called out from a human resource standpoint and from what I'd call an infrastructure standpoint. But definitely, and also my son's school's in KZN. So I had full visibility of everything that was happening in there. And for a long time, we could not access Hilton College as everything was going on. So it was very evident what was happening. And I think that has also given us a bit of insights just in terms of what to also expect when we're having our elections next year.
Thanks, Peter. I think let's jump in with Andrea.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, again, I won't answer all the questions because I think we'll be here for a long time. But if I can just touch on some of the points, you know, the effects of the riots, and everybody on the panel, and I guess the listeners lost something, and we obviously lost many of our stores due to the situation. Our logistics partner, lost their warehouse. And luckily we weren't affected as far as our warehouse was concerned in KZN. But what we did realize is, you know, the impact that this had on us is to coordinate. I think we had about 200 stores that were affected. Is to just coordinate the recovery plan. And again, as you said earlier, we have long lead times to build stores and stock supplies, etc. So you can imagine the coordination now and the communication internally to coordinate stock to, you know, first of all, get the shop fitters in. And I must say, those guys did remarkable work across all industry. I think shop fitters, glass suppliers, etc., they came to the party. I think over a very short period, many stores were rebuilt. But that aside, it's just for us in the retail side, we had to build the stock capacities. You know, you don't want to open a store with very low densities. You know, so a customer walks in and there's nothing in the store. So we had to go borrow from Peter to give to Paul, you know, so we had to go and coordinate and suck stock back from stores, pull stock in from containers, redistribute, realign, and then hold the stock in our DC. So this is something we'd never had to do at this mass or this size. It's like opening 200 stores on one day, you know. So all of a sudden, we had all the stock sitting in our warehouse, and we've run out of capacity. We jam-packed ourselves, and guess what? Black Friday stock is arriving. So that, and we're going into our peaks, you know. So that really taught us many lessons. I see some of the comments are coming out in the questions from the listeners, but we certainly learned a lot of lessons there, and that did impact us. It impacted our throughput, our supply to our trading stores. And then the coordination of actually getting the stock to those stores and ensuring that communication. One of the big things that did come out is how important that communication throughout the supply chain. And when we talk to supply chain, you're not just the movement of stock, but it's just the communication right down to the shop fitter and back up to the planning guys as to when to release, when is it safe to release, are the alarms on, you know. So you can't just pull the trigger. All the check boxes must be checked before you allow stock to run from your DC. So that was a big one for us. Obviously, when you start talking about impenetrable warehouses and sites, you know, that's quite a debate now. That's quite a hot topic. All of us, I think, all of us here are in the midst of either expanding, developing new sites. And this is a hot topic in the design phase. You know, what do? You make it a kind of a Fort Knox, you know, can you know, being on the retail side and the landlord, I mean, Rob, I don't think you want a concrete block, you know, as an attractive, you know, showpiece of big warehouses and so forth. They've become quite, you know, the architects generally try and put a bit of a artistic flair design to it as well to make it look attractive. You know, people want to come to work, you know, so they want to come to a place that is attractive to go to. And all of a sudden, all these debates are starting to creep up. You know, concrete walls versus an attractive facade. You know, open to the road. You know, to attract, you know, marketing and whatnot. You know, so these are the things we're currently busy looking at. And then the other thing was automation. I mean, you know, at what point do you bring in automation? And our biggest problem is labor costs versus automation versus capacity to drive the ROI on automation. At what point do you pull the trigger for automation to support ongoing business. So these are very topical debates. We haven't got the answers to all of it, and certainly these are debates that will continue for a short while still, because as long as these things are happening, this debate will continue. But a lot of us were making some radical decisions in terms of security. I think that's the first thing on the table.
I see Solly's jumping at the bit to jump in.
Sure, Gary. Not quite. I'm just trying to think through all my answers, given the learned comments so far on the table. I think I want to start off as someone that actually lived through this as well, being that I'm based in KZN. I think let's start with what was really, the key issue is that what was the reaction from people? And I think, there was first a disbelief, and then there was anger, and then there was organization, where people started to organize themselves. And I think that was the key at the end of the day, that people organized in the right way, because this thing could have gone very, very badly, very quickly. I do believe that people outside KZN do not realize how close we were to some really serious issues. Not that what has happened was not serious, but in terms of people reacting and communities reacting towards each other. Luckily, we managed to, I think the KZN population managed to calm a little bit down there and get that working in the right key. But I think some of the key issues that we realized is the vulnerability of the N3. We couldn't get food into KZN for 3 or 4 days. Our distribution center was closed for 3 or 4 days. Our truck fleet was grounded for 3 or 4 days. Stores were closed. People couldn't get food. So, and the N3, the security of the N3 is absolutely critical for both inbound and outbound deliveries. I think that was the key weakness that everybody could see, because you can't fly pallets and stuff like that in it. It has to come by either rail or by truck. So the N3 was, I think, the biggest single weakness in our province. And everybody realized how key lifeline that is to supply everybody. In terms of security, yes, we shut down our distribution centers. We took quite assertive steps to make sure that we work with the business community to make sure we can not just secure our own site, but also the business park in which it was situated. So I think that was the key learning. How do we make the security better? How do we improve the intelligence that we get? And also at the same time, once again, how do we make sure that our people actually want to come to work? Because remember, people were worried about what's happening at home, not just what's happening at work. Am I going to go home and will my house still be there tonight when I get home? It was that serious at the end of the day. So that was a dual role, not just providing security on our sites, but also providing security to our staff, that they can actually feel, I can actually come to home, I can come to work, and it will be safe for me to go home again. I think the key that we need to change is that as an industry, a supply chain industry, we need to be more forthcoming with sharing information in terms of potential impact in our business. I mean, again, we're seeing some activities taking place today right across the country with trucker blockades, etc., and those are the kind of things that we almost must treat like early warnings, and the effect that it's having on our supply chain. What do we need to change? I think that's the key. How do we become more aware, and how do we share this information across the industry? This is a non-competitive issue. I really felt so bad for Benny losing 2 distribution centers, because that's not the way we want to compete. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that everybody is safe and can compete on level grounds. The disaster recovery plans, we were much harder hit in terms of our stores, and in terms of where some of them were situated. Some of it was looted, some of it was burnt and looted, and we've amazingly did an amazing job in terms of recovering from that. And there's only a small minority of our stores that has not been able to reopen due to burning. So the key is everybody, our suppliers, our staff, our retailers, everybody reacted very, very quickly to change the focus from pure emotions of disappointment and anger to let's rebuild. That's the end of the day, all that matters. Let's rebuild. You know, we need to deal with what happened, who is responsible, who's accountable. But at the end of the day, we need to rebuild. Our country demands that of us, and it demands it of each and every one of us, because we can't go and sit in a heap and feel sorry for ourselves. We have to rebuild, and we have to move on, and we have to become better at what we're doing. So the key is, I think the learning for all of us is, how do we become more aware, and how do we share information across the industry to protect everybody at the end of the day? We don't want to see anybody's business being burned. We don't want to see anybody's business being looted. So how do we become cleverer to share information in a more proactive manner? And I think that for me is the key issue. That was the learnings out of this. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Solly. Anyone else want to comment on this, Peter or Rob? Rob?
Gary, if I could, yeah, just a couple of things. Just on security, I think, you know, Andrea, I don't think what everyone builds, whether it's concrete walls or what we saw go down, as Solly said, you know, I don't think you can protect against what actually happened and the scale of it. You need political will from the government to send in the Defence Force or SAPs to deal with it. And, you know, for whatever reason, that didn't happen. So I don't think one can legally plan for that kind of thing. You know, what we saw, the DCs that we saw that were saved were those that were kind of weren't initially hit, and they had a bit of time to plan. And, you know, Virginia Airport was a hive of activity with arms and ex-mercenaries being flown in and out. And again, I don't know how legal all of that was or how sustainable that kind of reaction is going forward. But that's the only thing that saved many facilities in KZN. The ones that got hit earlier, where you didn't have access to those services or time to plan, you know, there's no ways you could plan for that or protect it. It was overwhelming. I think for me, just what will be interesting going forward is to see whether the strategy of these big centralized facilities is one that continues gaining traction, or whether that's possibly deemed to be risky. You know, maybe have more decentralized facilities spread around the country. Be quite interested to see what you guys think of that. But just getting back, the big thing for me is the long-term damage. You know, if we want to grow the export market, the supply chain needs to be trust, and it needs to be predictability. And unfortunately, both of those have been damaged through what's happened. I mean, the citrus sector, for example, which by all accounts had a bumper season, you know, they couldn't get their produce out of the harbor. So, you know, that's probably hurt them. And then LG Electronics, you know, they moved. It was a specific high-tech TV manufacturing facility we developed for them in Durban. Hadn't even been in there a year, and that got torched. So they've made the decision now to exit the country and not manufacture going forward, and they'll just import. So there've been a number of jobs lost there, and it's just that long-term confidence in the system, I guess, for me is the worrying thing.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I think I'll just add 1 or 2 points. I think Solly covered quite a lot, but I think one of the key things that saved us in helping us to get those DCs up and running quite quickly was that the IT infrastructure wasn't damaged as badly as we thought. We could get that up and running. So, you know, I think as part of your BCP plans, to make sure you have the IT infrastructure, because, you know, to clean up the facility, you can do that quite quickly. And you know, Solly mentioned it, that, you know, the community and the people that were working in that DC, you know, they came back to work quite quickly and said, we want to work. So they cleaned up the DC quite quickly. But our worry was that we couldn't, you know, if you don't have Wi-Fi infrastructure, if you don't have the internet connection and stuff, you can't operate the DCs. And luckily we did, we could get our servers and stuff up and running quite quickly. But if you think about the shortages in international supply chain, if we had to suddenly bring in new servers and new Wi-Fi network and all of that, and we couldn't, and that, you know, that could have delayed us for 2 or 3 months. So as part of your plans, you have to have IT infrastructure. And then, yes, we are looking at making the site's security better and make it more secure. I don't think you can make it completely impenetrable, as as Andrea mentioned, you don't want concrete blocks, but we are looking at double perimeters and stuff like that. So that would be I think, a hard debate about security. And also in terms of the security personnel itself, you know, you need security now that's multi-skilled, you know, that can deal with riots and that is trained in riot control, not just you know, your basic security guard that sort of let people in and out of the gates.
I think one of the points mentioned is that the government needs to come to the party, because the legislation as it is, in terms of protecting things, in terms of what we as the civilians are allowed to use, and pepper spray and water cannons and things that would be tools, are illegal to be used by civilians, yet they become some of the only tools that we have that are relatively not lethal, that could actually control a mass riot of people. And if the police aren't there to do those jobs, which we pay them to do, we need people take it on privately. So I think there's also got to be a recognition that distribution centers are key points in the economy, and the economy needs its key points as well. So I think we've got a lot of challenges going forward, and I thank the panel, because I think by discussing these things and bringing it to the fore, it brings it to people's front of mind, and then we can actually, as a group, move forward and actually address these things with the right powers that be, or internally in our businesses, and put them forward as strategies. And I hope that the team that's on this will actually communicate amongst themselves, as well as between us as Relog in some of these things. I see we've got a hard stop at 10, so let's just jump on to some of the things that we're seeing that are going to affect us. Right now, our shipping costs from China are about 5 times as high as what they have been. Lead times 3 to 5 times longer, and sometimes they can't even give you any guesses. Fuel price is expected to go over $100 a barrel. There are supply shortages of all commodities, whether it's chips or steel or anything, and whether these are price gouging or artificial, or whether it's like Russia playing games with their gas, or real, but that's there. There are container shortages because of all of this, and shipping delays. We see in the UK, the international effect, the fuel, natural gas costs are going to influence their own shortages. They've got the shortage of labor and truck drivers. So anything that you're importing from the UK or Europe or America is affected by their supply chain impact. And I think those will have spin-offs to us. Going forward, what do we need to do in terms of planning, backup plans, alternatives? We talked about these, but some of the challenges we can expect. I think half of you guys are we only got 84 people. We had 120 sign up. I think the other bunch of them are having load shedding. Okay, we've got local elections coming up. Okay, it's a week away, and we haven't seen too much major issues, but who knows what happens between now and then. That we've had this NUMSA strike that's been going on. We still have continuous poor municipal service. There's reasons for people to be upset. And what effect will this have on sustainability and a focus of efficiency and getting product delivery at any cost? So we've been driving supply chain costs down just in time, doing the right thing, having green, efficient supply chains. And the worry is that all of those started to go out the window, because now we're starting to say, hold on, we need to hold backup inventories. We can source from the wrong countries because they're not, even though they're not green, but they're more guaranteed and things like that. So, and we talk about, what about all the food losses, job losses, and where's the potential in the future? So what's going to happen? So the fourth point to discuss, how can we build this resilient? What can you do to mitigate issues mentioned? And can we deal with the shipping issues? What options do we have? How do we deal with the political instability? And I suppose if we had a crystal ball and you knew how the answers to this, we'd all be rich people. And the ability to deliver at all cost on time, is it the key criteria? Or do we now have a new mantra, just deliver what you can when you can? Okay. And do you understand, do the customers understand the challenges and what we have to? And what impact does this have on the future of planning and confidence of our businesses? Anyone want to jump in?
Gary, I'll jump in. Is that all right? I'm not sure who else was wanting to
Please.
jump in, but I'll be short. Again, I think from a retail perspective, like I say, I think all retailers out there are starting to look at the question of onshoring versus imports. I think that's quite a key element that everybody's looking at in the retail sector. Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be looked at, and I think that also does. And I think business will put money where it makes sense for the business to put money into. And in the retail space, I guess if you're putting money into local manufacturing, it does make sense. And you're also employing people. You bolstering the local unemployment rate, and so that does help. It's not going to change the big problems, but I think it adds support to fixing things. How much we can onshore is debatable. Again, talking retail, as you mentioned earlier, we need to purchase cloth, and then we need to color the cloth, and we need to create patterns to manufacture. And so we don't have all the verticals in place. Your dye houses aren't up to scratch. They used to be, but they're not up to scratch. So not all of them. I mean, and so those are developing, and slowly we're getting there. So it'll take time. It will take time. It's just that how much money can you pump into this thing to make it work for you? And I think business will take bold steps, but steps that will still make business sense. I think that's what's going to be happening.
Thanks,
Gary,
Andrea.
I want to touch on the political instability and the issues around that. I think this is a really important consideration, and one that we must, continue to engage with government on. What we are finding is more and more service delivery protests taking place. I know we have local government elections next week, but in the bigger scheme of things, it means very little, because the number of service delivery protests over a year are increasing. I think they've doubled in the last 3 or 4 years, and year on year they're getting more, and that causes in itself a number of supply chain disruptions. And I think we need to have a better reaction from government and the security cluster to deal with political instability. But I think one of the things we need to be mindful of is when you look at the political landscape across South Africa, we're in a very sensitive situation. The African National Congress, which is the ruling party, there's so many divisions in there at the moment that if for example we went to an equation where CR was no longer the president, and we had someone like the former president in the equation, we find ourselves in a very difficult situation. So I think it's important, again, I reiterate, big business must engage with government. It's government's responsibility to make sure that there is political stability. One of the things we find helpful with the KZN riots, our warehouse was looted and our truck was burnt to cinders. But even our armed response people couldn't get to our warehouse because everything was blocked off. But what did help us was that a community neighborhood watch individual called us and said, we found one of your vehicles a few meters away from the warehouse, how can I help? And we actually engaged with them, and they could give us insights into what was happening at the warehouse, how badly the damage was. So I think one of the important considerations we must keep in mind, apart from the fact that government needs to create a stable political environment, is business must engage with local communities and make sure that local communities are aware of what's happening, because they know what's happening in the communities, and so that we have information beforehand to compare better. There's no amount of security personnel that's going to stop a mob of thousands of people. There's just no way that's going to happen. But I think if you can plan beforehand, and we can get security cluster and the government to respond faster, we can better deal with the crises in the future. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Andy. I see Andrea's got his hand back up.
Yeah, I got my hand up again. I think, obviously, Andy, certainly from my perspective, there are the short-term things which are government-related, and we have to put pressure on government to look at fixing things as big organization. But I think there's the longer-term issue. And for me, we were talking earlier about people sitting at home, needing a small nudge with some carrot to mobilize. we need to, and this is my view, we need big business to start your CSI programs, start investing in education. Take the communities around the area that your warehouses are in, your head offices are in, or your regional offices are in, and start uplifting those education environments. Because if we can't educate our people, they can't get jobs, or they're not empowered to better themselves. And it's just too easy to go and take something, and make a living out of that. And that's the danger that we're in. If we can't educate the mass of our population, we're in danger. So I think I know we've made efforts to support a lot of education programs. We do see that that's the future, and I implore everybody, to look into this. I think this is where, if we had to put CSI money into, I would certainly look at part of that going into education at ground level.
100% agree with you.
Yeah.
100%.
Thanks, Andrea. I see Peter has his hand up.
Thanks. So just building on the conversations that are happening, and there's of course a lot of parallels to draw across the continent. One thing that I think will become more apparent for us, we also consider ourselves to be in retail on the e-commerce side, is more of a upstream integration and just reducing the level of intermediaries that we have between ourselves and the products that we need, because with the amount of disruptions that you will have, and maybe the subsequent costs that you will have on other parts of the supply chain, there's of course need for us to continuously think about ways in which you can continue integrating as much as you can on the upstream side. On the political side, this has been a tough conversation for many people across the continent. What is characteristic in Kenya is that every 5 years when we have our election, we have an economic dip. And the reason why we have an economic dip in terms of growth, in terms of disposable income, is because there's also a lot of instability associated with this political cycle, so with these election cycles. And one of the things that we've stepped back is to then say, you know what, I think there's a couple of things that business needs to do. One is find ways to engage with the political class a lot more progressively, because one thing is very, very clear, is that without a functioning economy, then you cannot have a functioning country, and business plays a critical role in anchoring that. So that's one thing that we're going to drive more in this part of the world. And then the second thing is with every opportunity, with every situation, there is opportunity. And I think for us in business is to more or less start thinking differently in terms of what does this moments of instability or uncertainty bring in terms of opportunity, in a way that allows us to maintain the jobs that we have, allows us to maintain the taxes that we are paying, and essentially sustain the country through some of its periods. So it is a bit of a difficult situation that we find ourselves in, and one of the things that I find, for example, just working through COVID, one of the things I was really proud of is that, you know, we managed to work through that without laying off any folks, so there were no job losses. So some of these things are things that we need to also start positioning a lot more actively with government, just to understand that the consequences of what they do actually impacts the sustainability of a country.
I think if I can just jump in here, I think one of the biggest things, I think the mass population who engage on this, whether the people in the rights or the people just on the floor, often don't realize the effect of what supply chain and what we do and how it affects their lives. And so touching on the point that Andrea brought out about education, part of that education is educating people how supply chain works and where it fits into the cycle of life, and so that people actually respect it. I suppose one wouldn't go destroy a hospital or the doctors, maybe things happen, but because you realize the importance that those infrastructures have on your future and your bearing. And although people did destroy the supermarket where they get their source of food, so I don't know whether human character needs to be changed and so on, and we need to educate people to a level that they understand the consequences of their actions, and we need to rely on government to do some of it, but we also need to do it as part of our responsibility to the industry. It's a very difficult situation. We haven't heard from Rob for a while.
Yeah, Gary, look, completely agree with everything Andy said on the political side. You know, it's easy for me to sit and say we're scoring own goals because I live in a different world to probably 80–90% of the population. So it just feels like we're dealing with one setback after the other. You know, we deal with COVID, then the unrest, then the strikes. You know, the emergence of these business forums is another thing we haven't chatted about, particularly in KZN. But yeah, it just seems like we've got scoring these own goals the whole time, making life difficult for ourselves. But as I say, I say that from a privileged perspective, and I live in a different world to probably many of the population in this country. I think just from a real estate point of view, you know, Eskom's an issue, water supply, we're seeing that more and more. So it's part of your base build now to have backup power and water. You know, it's a non-negotiable going forward. And I think thankfully the cost of, you know, solar technology and all of those things is coming down, and coupled with the increase in Eskom's costs, you know, it's becoming a no-brainer now to look at PV installations. It's a lot more affordable, and the paybacks are now certainly there. So, you know, those are things that are in our control, the planning for water and electricity, but it adds to the cost of doing business. Just another thing that adds to the bottom line of the whole supply chain. Yeah.
As we go forward, I suppose, where does the future go? What can we expect, and what are the drivers? And we open the floor for some questions from the audience. There have been some good comments and questions, and I thought I'd dive into them. But Johan Nel, it's understood that DCs will be diversified to limit the value of stock per location. Where do the priorities lie? The impact of the risks they have on security costs for distribution network diversification. I suppose that comes down to the question of, are we trying to optimize our supply chains and our cost of supply chain, because cost of supply chain impacts cost of product on the shelf and effectively affordability to customer? Or are we trying to now build in disaster plans and risk and mitigation? And I suppose that's going to have a major effect on our conversation. I don't think we actually have the answer to that. Nicole, thank you for your comments. That's been great. And I think our biggest challenge going forward, and I don't want to belabor the point because we are running out of time. I just really want to thank all the panelists for making their time available to actually be part of this panel. Thank you for all engaging and really giving us your insights. And I hope that we can engage with you guys again on a panel. I see Solly has his hand up. I'd like Solly to jump in.
Oh, Gary, thank you very much. I think it's been a very interesting discussion this morning, and maybe I just want to end off from my side with an old saying. It is an old saying, come of the hour, come of the man. And I want to change that. I said, come of the hour, come of the supply chain. And all of us has got a responsibility, but more importantly, accountability to create a hope, because we all realize the impact that we have on people's lives with the supply chains that we manage and lead. So yeah, the hour is here, ladies and gentlemen. Let's be the best possible supply chain we can be and inspire our people and give them hope in terms of its future for our wonderful country. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Solly. And thanks for the team. Thanks for everyone. I mean, Andy, Peter, Rob, Andrea, really appreciate you being on, getting up this early, putting on a decent shirt to be able to stand in front of the camera. It's really been great. Okay, you guys can all get back to your t-shirts and sit there in your pajamas.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Gary. Thanks for this platform, and it's great to have these sessions with Relog.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Gary. Bye-bye.
Bye.
By the way, there will be a recording on the Relog website.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye.